Every house, every king, and every battle has its own truth, yet some lives echo louder than crowns, and some names linger longer than the thrones they served. There are stories older than crowns, darker than the night, and more dangerous than any blade, not because of dragons or spells, but because of the quiet choices that bend the fate of kingdoms. They are not carved in marble or sung in loud halls. They are hidden in scars and in secrets, in the trembling of hands that sign orders for war, in the soft rustle of parchment where death is written in ink. The wind howled over the narrow seas and the mountain passes of Westeros, carrying with it the murmur of such forgotten truths, while lords in golden armour believed that history would remember only their banners and their blood. Across this land of cold seas and hard stone, his ancient castles rose like teeth against the sky. Winterfell brooded in the frozen north, where the snow fell silent and the old gods watched with sightless eyes. Far to the south, the Red Keep clung to its hill above the black water, a nest of whispers and knives. Between them stretched river and forest and field, all bound beneath names that hung over the realm like a gathering storm: Stark, Targaryen, Lannister. Those names were promises and threats, prayers and curses. They spoke of dragonfire falling upon cities, of wolves howling in the dark, of lions painted in red and gold upon proud shields. Yet for all their splendour, for all their songs, the truth of Westeros did not live only in its kings and conquerors. It lived in the shadows that trailed behind them, in the small figures who slipped between their feet, all unseen and underestimated, and already burned with a fire they refused to see. The maesters wrote of great lords and their victories, of treaties sealed and crowns exchanged. They told of Aerys the mad king and Robert the usurper, of queens who burned and princes who bled. But parchment is a poor witness. It does not remember the taste of fear on a child's tongue, or the way hatred can grow in a father's eyes. Official histories are written by victors. The real account is etched instead into broken bones, into sleepless nights, into the moment a man chooses mercy over vengeance, or vengeance over love. Among those unwritten chronicles lies the life of one small man, born beneath a golden lion. His name was Tyrion Lannister. To courts and crowds he was a dwarf, a jest, a twisted shadow trailing behind the towering figure of his father. Yet from that day forth, when he first opened his mismatched eyes, his existence began to warp the paths of those who believed themselves his betters. He would grow to shape wars he never started, to save a city that spat upon him, to topple the very man who gave him life, and to choose a king from the ruins of all that fire and blood had destroyed. This is not merely the tale of mockery and wine, of cruel jests and sharper tongues. It is the slow unfolding of a soul that refused to break, no matter how the world tried to crush it. So let the torches burn low and the night grow deep. Imagine an old, forbidden book opened by candlelight, its pages smelling of dust and old smoke, its margins stained by hands long turned to bone. Within it lies the entire span of Tyrion Lannister's days, from his first hated breath to his final weary choice. Turn the first page and watch how the smallest shadow begins to move. The lion's secret, a life the songs, refuse to sing. The smallest shadow moves, and a name stirs with it, wrapped in mockery and wine. They called him the Imp. They called him the Halfman. In halls of gold and crimson light, his name was a jest passed from mouth to mouth, a convenient laughter to drown out darker truths older than crowns, darker than the night, and more dangerous than any blade. In the great feast halls, he played the fool. He raised his cup, spat barbs sharper than daggers, and let the storm of laughter crash over his head like cold sea spray. Yet when the torches guttered and the revels died, he walked alone through stone corridors where the wind howled against the cliffs of Casterly Rock. Behind his mismatched eyes lay hours with ink-stained fingers, ancient books, and maps of lands he might never see. And behind that, deeper still, lay the ache of a child whose birth had killed his mother and broken his father's pride. His nights were made of study, drink, and pain. Study, to arm a stunted body with a sharper weapon. Drink, to drown the memory of Tisha's screams and the taste of his own shame in the dust of the barracks floor. Pain, because in a world that worshipped height and beauty, every glance became a cut, every whisper a blade laid against his throat. From that day forth, when Tywin's men had done as they were bid, and his father had watched in cold silence, he understood that love could be turned into punishment, and that Lannister's word could be as cruel as any sword. His life became a kind of forbidden knowledge, a living proof of how power treats those who do not fit its chosen image. A dwarf in a lion's den, a mind caged in a body made for derision. His wit grew precise, merciless, more dangerous than any blade, until even kings listened when he spoke and queens flinched when he smiled. For all their banners and bright steel, the great lords feared words they could not predict. Behind every king's decree there were unseen hands. In the shadows of the Red Keep, his hands were often among them. It was Tyrion who read the ledgers, who smelled the rot beneath the silk, who set the wildfire beneath the Blackwater, and watched green fire climb into the night. When Stannis' fleet burned, and the city howled in terror, Fathers of the songs named Joffrey and Tywin, but the smoke that choked the sky carried Tyrion's unspoken name. So a question lingered, coiled like a serpent at the heart of his story. Was he a hero who saved a city and later chose a better king, or a broken man whose cleverness helped unleash horrors he could never master? Already he burned with a fire that would one day draw dragons, topple tyrants, and bury children beneath falling stone. To understand how kings fell and dragons burned, the tale cannot begin with a crown. It begins in a high chamber where a woman screamed and bled, where a lord's hope died with his lady, and where a newborn's first cry turned celebration into curse. In that room, as the wind howled beyond the tower windows and Tywin Lannister's face turned to carved stone, the fate of a son was sealed, and the realm shuddered without yet knowing why. Born under a curse. The night Tyrion came screaming. Casterly Rock rose from the western sea like a petrified wave, frozen in the act of crashing down upon the shore. Beneath its cliffs the ocean raged and clawed, the waves breaking themselves to white foam against stone older than crowns, darker than the night, and more dangerous than any blade. Above, within the mountain's hollow heart, golden halls glittered with firelight and wealth, while deep below the rock's veins ran cold and silent as buried ice. The wind howled through high arrow slits and hidden shafts, carrying the salt stink of the sea into chambers hung with crimson and gold. Torches painted lions on the walls in dancing shadow, their eyes seeming to watch every passer-by. Servants moved softly along polished floors, their whispers swallowed by thick stone, as if the castle itself listened and judged. Here the Lannisters ruled like kings in all but name, their word as heavy as the rock that cradled them. On one storm-tossed night, the rock held its breath. In a high chamber, Joanna Lannister laboured beneath silken canopies, sweat and blood darkening the fine linens, her fingers clawing at the bed as each wave of pain broke over her. Midwives murmured to one another in low, urgent tones. A maester bent over her with shaking hands. Outside the door, guards shifted their weight, eyes fixed on the stones as if afraid to meet one another's fear. At first there was hope. A son for Tywin, another lion's roar to echo through the generations. Then the labour dragged on longer and harsher, until hope thinned to a tight, brittle silence. It's as somewhere in the corridors a goblet of wine went untouched. Somewhere in the great hall a fire sank low. When the child finally came, he came screaming, small, twisted, a dwarf. His head too large, his limbs stunted, his skin slick with his mother's blood. Joanna's breathing faltered, then failed, as if the life had been pulled from her and poured into this strange wailing thing. Joy turned in a heartbeat to horror. A lady of the rock lay still. A son lived where she did not. Tywin Lannister entered to the sound of that thin, insistent cry. He stood very still, the storm muttering beyond the shutters, the air heavy with blood and smoke. His name was Tyrion, the master whispered. But Tywin's eyes did not soften at the word. He looked upon the child as upon a sentence passed. He said little. He did not need to. From that day forth, the silence around his youngest son was more eloquent than any curse. Servants lowered their eyes when they carried the babe. Nurses crossed themselves when they thought no one watched. The rock itself seemed to grow colder around him, as if the walls resented the echo of his small footsteps. In Tywin's mind, dwarfism and death fused into a single sin. This boy was the shape of weakness, the cost of failure, the living reminder of a love lost and a legacy marred. Yet he was still a Lannister. Gold surrounded him, piled in vaults and worked into the very fixtures of his nursery. Meisters came with books, tutors with lessons, as if learning might polish away what nature had carved. Already he burned with a fire of quick words and quicker thoughts, a dragon of the mind caged in a broken body. She, but the one thing he sought above all, a father's gaze that saw a son, not punishment, remained out of reach, colder than any stone. In that glittering prison above the roaring sea, Tyrion Lannister began his life as both lordling and outcast, cherished by no parent, watched by 1,000 eyes. The boy who killed his mother merely by being born learned early that love could be rarer than gold, and that a sharp tongue might be the only shield he would ever truly wield. A lion in miniature. Childhood in the golden cage. Casterly Rock rose from the western sea like a carved mountain of pride, its halls lined with golden lions that watched in silent judgment. Their stone eyes were tall, straight, perfect. The boy who walked beneath them was none of those things. His name was Tyrion Lannister, and from his first staggering steps he moved like a living floor in a house that worshipped symmetry. The corridors whispered of glory. Tapestries showed Lannister hosts beneath crimson banners, swords raised, sunlight blazing upon their armour like fire. Between those woven battles, a small figure hurried in the shadow of pillars, head too large, legs too short, gaze too sharp. Servants glanced away. Some crossed themselves as if warding off a curse older than crowns, darker than the night, and more dangerous than any blade. Only one presence broke that circle of fear. Jaime Lannister, golden as the lions on the walls, would stoop without shame, let his brother scramble up his back and carry him laughing through the echoing galleries. Jaime raced down stairways like a storm given human shape, Tyrion clinging to him. The wind howled in the open courts, and for a moment the dwarf was not a burden, but a rider. The rock became a playground instead of a prison when Jaime was near. Jaime spoke to him as if he were a boy, not a mistake. He taught him the names of knights and battles, the secret passages behind the lordly chambers, the rhythm of swordplay, even if Tyrion's hands could never quite mimic the dance. When others stared, Jaime met their eyes until they looked away. From that day forth, Tyrion understood that one brother could be a shield against a world that would never bow. Cersei was the other face of that world. Her beauty moved through the same corridors like a blade wrapped in silk, her green eyes cold as deep water. She watched Tyrion with a revulsion she did not trouble to hide, lips curling when he approached, but voice soft only when it carried poison. More than once, in rooms where the candles burned low and the sea roared below, she whispered that it should have been him who died, not their mother, that his birth had stolen their joy and left only blood and shadow. Words were her chosen weapons, and she used them without mercy. She called him monster, imp, little beast, until those names clung to him like a second skin. Each insult struck deeper than any switch. Yet in that cruelty, something hard began to form within him. If love would not come, then armour must. He found that armour first in books. The rock held libraries as vast as its vaults, shelves heavy with histories, ledgers, tales of dragons and dead kings. While other children trained in the yard, Tyrion read beneath high windows where the light fell pale and steady. He drank in laws, battles, riddles, the secret machinery of coin and crown. Knowledge did not flinch from his face. Knowledge did not look away. If his body was a jest, his mind would be the answer. He learned that a question at the right moment could be more dangerous than any blade. That memory could turn a careless boast into a future noose. Already he burned with a fire that had nothing to do with swords or banners, a fierce, quiet hunger to see beneath every mask. Wine followed books, first stolen sips, then brimming cups. It blurred the sharpest edges of contempt, turned the rock's cold stone into something almost warm. In low taverns clinging to the cliffs, and in secret chambers behind Lannister doors, he discovered another trade that did not recoil from his form. Whores took his coin and his jokes alike. Their laughter was bought. But it was laughter all the same, So he made himself the jester of his own misfortune. He called himself Imp before others could, mocked his stature, his appetites, his unlovable face. If he leaned into vice, if he wrapped himself in wine and women, then perhaps the world's scorn would land on the mask and not the flesh beneath. He turned shame into a story he told first and loudest. Yet beneath the jokes, the books, the cups of red that stained his lips like blood, the child of Casterly Rock listened and watched. Every glance from Tywin, every flinch from Cersei, every kindness from Jaime was stored away in that restless mind. In those early years, the smallest lion in the golden cage was already learning to bare his teeth, and the day would come when the world beyond those stone walls would feel the bite. Tisha's smile. The first great lie of his life. Beyond the golden cage of Casterly Rock, the world felt wider, rougher, almost kind. The wind howled along the road, tugging at cloaks and banners, and for the first time the smallest lion rode without a roof of carved stone pressing down upon him. Jaime rode beside him, bright as hammered sun, laughing, teasing, yet in that easy mockery there was a rare gift. The sense that Tyrion was simply a brother on the road, and not ashamed to be hidden. Every mile carried them farther from Tywin's cold eyes and Cersei's curled lip. The inns were smoky, the ale thin, the beds lumpy. But in that brief wandering, Tyrion tasted a freedom older than crowns, darker than the night, and more dangerous than any blade. No stewards watching his gate. No masters whispering of omens, only mud, horse sweat, zest and the promise of chance waiting at the next bend in the road. Her name was Tysha. She came to them in a storm of rain and fear, a common girl on a lonely road, claiming brigands had chased her from her home. Her hands shook, yet her laugh, when it came, was warm as summer wine. She looked at Tyrion and did not flinch. She met his eyes and saw, or seemed to see, a man and not a monster, a boy with wild, dark hair and quick wit. Not merely the crooked shadow of a great lord. The hours that followed were a whirl of firelit talk and stolen glances. Jaime, ever the golden hero, rode off in pursuit of imaginary foes, leaving his little brother alone with the girl and the knight. Tyrion, drunk on freedom and kindness, found courage he'd never known beneath those crushing Lannister ceilings. There were kisses that tasted of rain. There were whispered promises in a ruined barn with the storm beating time upon the roof. By dawn there were vows, a drunken septon, a hastily spoken ceremony, a girl who wept with joy, and a boy who dared for once to believe. In those brief days that followed, Tyrion walked as if taller. He bought her ribbons and bread, and spoke of futures he had never allowed himself to dream. From that day forth, for as long as that fragile dream endured, he believed he could be loved for himself and not his name or his gold. Then Tywin learned. Summoned back to Casterly Rock, dragged from that small secret happiness, Tyrion stood before the Lord of the Rock and felt the air grow cold. Tisha was brought in first, her face streaked with tears, forced to confess before a hall of hard-eyed men that she had been a whore hired by Jaime for a jest. Each word struck like a lash. Each denial died on Tyrion's tongue as his father's command fell like a sentence of death. One by one the guards were ordered to take her, to throw her down and pay her a silver stag for her screams. Tyrion was made to watch as the line of men moved like a slow, relentless tide, as her cries turned ragged and her voice broke, as the barn that had once echoed with laughter filled instead with the sound of ruin. When his turn came, Tywin's cruelty sharpened. A gold dragon for a Lannister, a lesson stamped in coin and blood. He obeyed. He went to her last with the eyes of his father and the whole rock upon him, and something inside him cracked like thin ice under too much weight. Love was twisted into humiliation, trust curdled into poison. Yes, already he burned with a fire of shame and hatred that no wine would ever fully drown. From that night, he learned that anything which made Tywin feel small would be ground to dust, even his son's heart. The memory of Tisha's smile rotted into a wound that would never close, and the boy who had believed in vows began to believe in nothing at all. Yet somewhere, buried beneath wine and whorehouse laughter, that broken vow waited, and when another woman would come to lie beside him in a different bed, under a different sky, the ghost of Tisha would rise and the price of that first great lie would finally be paid. The wandering imp, Exile in wine and wit wine became his armour. Laughter, his shield. In the years that followed Tisha's unmaking, the boy who had believed in nothing set himself adrift upon the roads of the realm. A small sharp shadow in crimson and gold moving from tavern to tavern, from lowborn bed to highborn hall. He was welcomed wherever his purse was heavy and his tongue was quick. Never for his face, never for his name. In smoky alehouses along the Gold Road, in river inns where the wind howled against warped shutters, the dwarf from Casterly Rock bought casks of red and barrels of brown, and the songs grew louder when he entered. Men learned that a jest from Tyrion Lannister could turn a dull night bright, and that his coin flowed as freely as the wine he poured down his own throat. From that day forth, a different legend began to cling to him. His name was whispered with a crooked sort of admiration. A Lannister who paid his debts, and paid them in full. A dwarf who drank like a hedge knight after battle, and spoke with the cool precision of a maester before a brazier of coals. He mocked himself first and most cruelly, stripping every insult of its sting. What weapon remained for those who wished to wound a man who had already carved his own flesh with words more dangerous than any blade? Yet beneath the japes and the wine-dark haze he watched. Always he watched. Others studied maps and marches. Tyrion studied mouths and eyes. In a seltzer's twitching hand he read hunger. In a merchant's stiffened jaw he tasted pride. In the way a lord's gaze slid from his twisted legs to the nearest door he measured fear. He walked through rooms as other men walked battlefields, marking high ground and hidden pits, learning that silence could be a spear and a raised cup a banner. He came to believe a hard, bitter creed, older than crowns, darker than the night that had swallowed his first love. Cripples, bastards, broken things. None would be granted fair field or equal steel, so they must seek other arms. Books became his quiet companions, their pages whispering of dragons and dead kings, of siegecraft and statecraft, of poisons without scent and laws written in blood. Knowledge, he decided, was a kind of fire in the mind, and already he burned with a fire that no lord could see until it scorched him. Once, on a storm-tossed crossing to Dragonstone, a knight laughed that the imp feared the sea. Tyrion only smiled and asked very softly whether the man feared drowning. The jest died. The knight looked away, a small moment, easily forgotten, yet such moments were his training. As real as any boy with wooden sword in a yard. Years turned, roads blurred, brothels and castles, cellars and solar chambers, all folded into one long wine-stained tapestry. Then, at last, a summons from the king and queen, and a journey not to some nameless inn, but north into the teeth of the cold. The wind howled over the King's Road as he rode toward Winterfell, toward a man of ice and honour, and a boy who dreamed of knighthood. Beyond them waited a wall of stone and frozen memory, and upon it another outcast, Jon Snow, staring into a darkness that would soon stare back. Cripples, bastards, and broken things, a meeting at the wall. The wind howled along the King's Road, clawing at cloaks and banners, driving needles of cold rain into man and horse alike. Far to the north the sky darkened, as if the world itself were drawing a curtain over its last warm lights, and bidding them ride into something older than crowns, darker than the night, and more dangerous than any blade. Step by step, mile by weary mile, the land thinned. Forest gave way to stone, stone to frost, and at last to the white immensity of the far north. Tyrion Lannister rode beneath a sky the colour of old iron, his breath a pale ghost before his face, until the wall rose from the earth like a frozen storm. It was not a mere fortification. It was a cliff of blue-white fire in the sunless light, ancient black stone and ice fused together, a barrier at the edge of the world where wind and fear had teeth. Upon the King's Road he had traded japes with Jon Snow, the bastard in black, a dwarf and a bastard, thrown together by chance and by the quiet cruelty of a lord's household that always knew which child stood outside the circle of the hearth. At first, there were only barbs. Tyrion mocked the boy's solemn honour. Jon bristled, hand never far from the hilt he dreamed would make him a knight. Yet beneath the mockery, something watched from behind their eyes, measuring, recognizing. In the flicker of campfire beneath a hard, pale moon, their talk deepened. Tyrion spoke of books and battles fought in ink and parchment, of dragons long gone and kings whose names were dust. Jon spoke of Winterfell's shadows, of being the snow in a hall of direwolves, always half welcome, never fully claimed. Between them lay the shared knowledge that birth could wound as sharply as steel. Oh, it was then that Tyrion gave the boy the truth that had armoured him all his life. Wear it like armour, he said of the word bastard, and it could never be used to cut him. Name the shame, drink it, breathe it, let it harden around the heart until mockery slid from it like rain from stone. The world was cruelest to those who never chose their lot, to those whose first breath was taken already marked in the eyes of others. At the wall, where the wind howled through frozen crenellations and the Black Brothers moved like shadows against the snow, that insight met its first test. Jon, flush with new authority among boys, more frightened than fierce, turned his back on the soft weeping son of a southern lord, Samwell Tarly, all trembling flesh and stammered words. Here, in this place of swords and oaths, such weakness seemed a death sentence. Tyrion saw something else. In Sam's quaking hands and downcast eyes, he recognized the same quiet terror that had once gripped a boy beneath his father's golden lion. With a few cutting jests and a gentler word hidden beneath them, he nudged Jon toward a different kind of strength. A leader did not merely swing a blade. He decided who would stand beside him when the night grew long, protect the craven, and in time he might stand firm. Abandon him, and the blood spilled would haunt more than dreams. From that day forth, Jon Snow began to look not only at swords, but at souls, and Tyrion, descending from the wall with the cold still biting his bones, already he burned with a fire of grim understanding. That the broken, the maimed, the unwanted were his true kin. Ahead waited war, wildfire, and dragons wheeling over burning cities. A storm of choices where his mercy would clash with iron necessity. In that coming darkness, it would be the cripples, bastards, and broken things who would test whether his armour of wit could still shield those he understood best. Caught in the web, kidnapping, trial, and first blood, the road to war is paved not only with banners and dragons, but with quiet betrayals in forgotten rooms. The night Tyrion's path truly bent toward blood began in a low inn, where the rain drummed like distant drums of war upon the roof, and the wind howled around crooked eaves, as if some older thing sought a way inside. The common room at the crossroads was thick with smoke and muttered talk, a place of damp cloaks, tired horses, and men too weary to care about lords. Tyrion drank, played at courtesy, let his sharp tongue dance just enough to keep the night from growing dull. Then Catelyn Stark rose, her eyes hard as winter stone, and named his crimes in a voice that cut through clatter and laughter alike. In a heartbeat, a casual halt upon the King's Road became a death sentence, as blades scraped from scabbards and bannermen answered a lady's call older than crowns, darker than the night. Protect, avenge, obey. They dragged him east beneath a sky of iron clouds, up goat paths and treacherous ledges where one misstep meant a fall into endless mist. The wind tore at cloaks. The mountain air grew thin and cold. His captors had already judged him, saw only a Lannister's gold and a dwarf's twisted frame, and in their eyes guilt was as certain as sunrise. So he reached for the only weapons left to him, his wits, his promises, his purse. A whispered offer here, a carefully chosen insult there, testing each man's greed and pride, searching for a crack in the armour of their certainty. Yet in the Eyrie, there was little room for cracks. The castle clung to the sky like a pale claw, its halls bright and chill, its justice as narrow as the stone paths that led to it. They cast him into a sky cell, a room with 3 walls of rough stone, and a 4th that was nothing at all, only open air and a floor that sloped gently toward the waiting void. At night, when the wind howled up from the valley, the drop seemed to lengthen, and even a man of stronger legs might have felt fear gnawing like rats at his resolve. Tyrion lay upon cold stone, watching stars wheel beyond that cruel edge. Death waited one careless step away, patient as any jailer. Yet he refused to crawl, refused to confess to a crime he had not committed. From that day forth, he would remember that terror whenever he saw another soul pressed toward an abyss by those who mistook power for truth. At last, with his life hanging by a thread thinner than spider silk, he demanded the one right that remained to him: trial by combat in a hall where no one loved him, and many wished to see his blood upon the stones. His name was Bronn, the man who answered. No knight's vows bound him, no songs had ever carried his deeds. He stepped forward not for honour but for coin, measuring Tyrion with quick assessing eyes that weighed risk and reward with brutal clarity. In the moonlit sky garden, steel rang on steel as Ser Vardis Egan fought in shining mail and duty, while Bronn moved like a shadow, circling, retreating, letting the older man tire, letting weight and pride become shackles. It was not a glorious duel, it was efficient, merciless, inevitable. When Vardis fell, his blood dark upon pale stone, the Vale's high lords recoiled from the verdict their own laws had summoned. Tyrion stood small and unarmoured, yet alive, his fate decided by another man's sword arm and the thin edge of a sellsword's ambition. Already he burned with a fire of grim comprehension. In this world, justice was more dangerous than any blade, and survival often belonged to those who could purchase the right killer at the right time. He walked free of the Eyrie, but not free of peril. The name Lannister clung to him like a crimson cloak, bright as a target in the dark. Catelyn's accusation had lit a spark in the dry tinder of old grudges, and somewhere beyond the mountains, in which other foes were already sharpening steel and stories alike. This was only his first escape from the noose, the first time chance and a stranger's sword had dragged him back from the brink. Ahead, more trials waited, more combats fought by other hands, while he gambled with words and gold. How many times could one small man dance upon the edge of so many blades before the dance at last went wrong? The unwanted hand, thrown into the heart of power blades, would not be the only things he must dance between. There were other edges in Westeros, edges made of words and whispers, more dangerous than any blade, and they waited for him where the sea met the rotting mouth of power. The wind howled over Blackwater Bay as his ship crept toward King's Landing, carrying him from the wild mountains into a city that stank of smoke, sewage, and fear. Above the cramped, crooked alleys, the Red Keep rose in tiers of red stone, looming like a dragon of brick and blood, its towers clutching at the sky. Inside those walls, the Iron Throne sat beneath a ceiling of shadows, and upon that throne lounged a boy king with a wolf's head on a spike and cruelty shining in his eyes. Tywin Lannister did not send his youngest son there out of love. Far away in the Riverlands, where the war with Robb Stark raged through rain and mud, the Lord of Casterly Rock needed a hand to hold the reins of the capital while his own hands were busy with steel. He chose Tyrion because he was clever, because he was expendable, and because it amused him to throw the despised dwarf into the fire while keeping the golden heir at his side. From that day forth, every victory Tyrion won would taste of contempt. He entered the Red Keep not as a guest, but as a storm. In the throne room, with Joffrey preening and Cersei coiled beside him like a serpent in silk, Tyrion's voice cut through the hot, stale air. He mocked the boy's tantrums, named his cruelties for what they were, and set the small council buzzing like a nest of disturbed wasps. With Cersei he used another blade, truth, honed with bitter jest. He reminded her of burning cities and hungry mobs, of how quickly love turned to hatred when the bread ran out. Quietly he began to move pieces. Janos Slynt was torn from the gold cloaks and shipped to the wall, his power broken. Pycelle's beard was shorn and his chains stripped, his false frailty dragged into the light. Little by little, Cersei's creatures were pushed from key positions, replaced by men whose loyalty lay for a time in Tyrion's shadow. Yet the true game unfolded in whispers. His name was tested on the tongues of Varys, Littlefinger and Pycelle, each a spider in his own web. Tyrion fed each man a different secret. 3 rival plans for Princess Myrcella's marriage. When the Queen's fury erupted over one alone, the trail of treachery led straight to Pycelle's door. In that moment, Tyrion saw how information could burn hotter than wildfire. Here lay the cruelest irony. While Tywin shattered armies in the Riverlands, it was the son he scorned who held King's Landing together with ruse and resolve. Already he burned with a fire of his own, unseen beneath silks and scars, steadying a city that did not want him, saving a crown that spat upon his name. How long could such a man prop up a realm that would rather see him fall? Yisakwi Jat Wildfire and Iron, the Night. He saved a city. On the eve of ruin, the city held its breath. The wind howled along the black stones of King's Landing, carrying the stink of fear from 100,000 throats out over Blackwater Bay, where ships like shadowed teeth waited in the dark. Behind the walls, candles guttered in shuttered windows, as if the very fire of the city shrank from the storm that crept closer with every oar stroke. Out upon the water, the bay seemed empty. Yet beneath that deceptive calm, Wildfire slept in shattered casks and broken pots, chained to a single, baited ship set like rotten meat in the narrow channel. It was an alchemy of slaughter, older than crowns, darker than the night, and more dangerous than any blade. His name was Tyrion Lannister, and he had ordered it lit. On the walls, torches hissed in the sea wind. Joffrey strutted in gilded armour, voice shrill with borrowed courage, pointing with a boy's petulant sword toward the darkness where Stannis Baratheon's fleet advanced. His boasts rang thin against the crash of distant waves. The king's bravado was a painted shield. Behind it lay only cold and panic. Tyrion stood smaller than every man around him, helm too large, lion crest tilting askew like some cruel jest of the gods. Yet his eyes were steady. Already he burned with a fire of his own, not the mad green of wildfire, but a hard, contained blaze that turned fear into calculation. He had no dragon, no prophecy, no love from the crowd. He had only his mind, and tonight that would have to be enough. The signal went up. A single flaming arrow arced from the walls, a brief line of orange against the void. It kissed the baited ship. For a heartbeat, nothing changed. Then the bay erupted. Wildfire bloomed in screaming emerald, a tide of liquid flame racing across the black water, climbing masts, devouring sails, swallowing men who leapt burning into a sea that burned with them. The night became a green dawn of death. Ships cracked like kindling. Men howled as armor turned to ovens. Smoke rolled toward the walls, thick and choking, veiling the slaughter that Tyrion had summoned with ink and whispers days before. Victory, paid for in charred flesh. But fire on the water could not stop steel on the land. Stannis' survivors clawed their way ashore, grim and relentless, hurling themselves at the mud gate. Stone shook. The gate splintered. The defenders wavered, some already turning to run. Their king had slunk back to the Red Keep. Their lords hid behind closed doors. Tyrion rode before them, absurd in over through the clamour. "Those are brave men knocking at our door," he said, words dry as old wine, sharp as a slap. "Let us go kill them." Laughter, raw and startled, broke from a few throats. Then a roar. Shame turned to fury. Side by side with men who spat his name, Tyrion led the sortie through the shattered gate, into mud churned with blood and ash. Steel rang, shields splintered. He stumbled, swung, felt the jolt of blade on bone. In that crush of bodies, his courage was no longer measured in schemes, but in inches of ground taken and held. The storm of battle swirled around him. The world shrank to flashes of steel, to the hot stink of breath inside his helm, to the red mist that sprayed his visor as another man fell. He pushed forward, shouting hoarse orders, holding the line while the city's great lords stayed safe behind stone. Then, in the chaos, a white cloak loomed at his side. Sir Mandon Moore, silent as ever, face unreadable beneath his helm. Relief flickered through Tyrion, a brief, unguarded trust. The sword came from nowhere. Cold steel kissed his face, then tore it open. Pain like molten iron split the world. He fell to his knees as blood poured into his eyes, turning fire and moon and torches into a red, drowning haze. The wind howled over the burning bay while the ground rushed up to meet him. As darkness closed in, one truth cut deeper than the blade. The city he had saved still wanted him dead. Someone within his own shadow had raised that treacherous hand, and when he woke, if he woke at all, the face that had faced down a king in a storm would never be the same again. The scar and the mockery. Victory turned to ash. He fell into darkness with steel in his face and fire in his lungs. And when he rose again, it was not to glory. It was to silence. To the slow, suffocating knowledge that victory can taste of ash and blood and nothing more. He woke in a room that smelled of rot-gut wine and old smoke. No trumpets, no cheers. Only a ragged breath scraping in his throat and a weight of bandages pulling at his skin. His tongue found broken teeth, the copper sting of blood, the bitter tang of metal where a shattered helm had kissed bone. One eye opened to a slit of candlelight, raw, swimming, crooked. The other sank into darkness and stayed there. Pain arrived in waves. First, dull, then sharp, then a storm that broke across his skull. When his shaking fingers crept upward, linen met them, rough and thick, wrapped tight around a face that no longer felt like his own. He understood, slowly, as a man might understand a sentence of death read in a foreign tongue. He was alive. He was no longer whole. The wind howled outside the shutter, but within the chamber another sound rose, a soft gasp, quickly strangled. A serving girl had come with broth. Her eyes darted to the blood seeping through the cloth, then away, as if the sight itself might curse her. Later a maester hovered, reciting herbs and poultices with all the warmth of a ledger, never quite looking him in the ruined half of his face. Even in pain, Tyrion heard the flinch that people tried to hide. It was a language older than crowns, darker than the night, and more dangerous than any blade. When at last they let him stand, he demanded a mirror. The glass showed him a stranger carved by war. One eye swollen and fierce, the other lost in a red canyon of torn flesh that dragged his mouth into a permanent sneer. He studied it a long while, his breath thin. Then softly he laughed, a dry, brittle sound. His name was Tyrion Lannister, he murmured, and this is the thanks he earned for saving a city that hated him already. Beyond his door, the city roared for another. Tywin Lannister rode through the gates in polished mail, lions gleaming, banners snapping in the cold wind. To the mob, his was the hand that had broken Stannis, his was the mind that had tamed wildfire and storm. While bells rang for the great lord returning, Tyrion was wheeled from the Tower of the Hand, his bed and books and maps spirited away to smaller, meaner chambers that smelled of damp stone and forgotten men. From that day forth, the tale of Blackwater was told in lion gold. Tywin the Saviour, Joffrey the Brave. The imp, if mentioned at all, became a grotesque footnote, a maimed curiosity who had once worn the handspin like a jester borrowing a crown. The knowledge settled on Tyrion's chest like armour that did not fit, heavy and cold. Yet in the narrow circle of his own night, there was one face that did not turn away. Shae came to him with soft hands and sharper words, cursing the fools who whispered, mocking the cowards who stared. In her arms his fear dulled, his scar became a story instead of a sentence. And for a few stolen hours he could pretend that the fire in her eyes was meant for him, and him alone. He knew better. The lesson of Tisha was written in his bones, in screams and silver, and the sound of his father's voice. Love, for a man like him, was a hired costume, beautiful and false and always returned at dawn. Yet still he clung to Shae, to her laughter, to the fragile lie that someone might choose him despite the ruin. Already he burned with a fire that was equal parts longing and self-contempt, knowing that this comfort was also a blade pointed at his heart. Outside, the lions feasted, and the bards sang of other men. Inside, in a dim room where the wind worried at the shutters and the candles guttered low, Tyrion Lannister counted his losses. An eye, a title, a father's grudging notice, a city's fleeting gratitude. The scar upon his face was only the first mark. Deeper wounds were coming, carved not by steel but by love, by family, by the quiet erasure of all that he had done, and in that gathering shadow, the smallest lion began to understand that surviving the battle was only the beginning of the war. Chains of gold, marriage, duty, and a doomed love. The wind howled around the red walls of the capital, as if the city itself objected, yet within the sept the bells rang and the candles burned, and a girl of the north was bound to a lion she had been taught to hate. Sansa Stark walked like a ghost through her own wedding, her father dead, her brothers slain or scattered, her home in ashes. Tywin Lannister saw only opportunity. Winterfell was more than stone. It was memory, harvest, and the long strength of the North. In Sansa, Tywin glimpsed a claim older than crowns, darker than the night, and more dangerous than any blade. With Robb Stark in open rebellion, with the Riverlands aflame, he chose to seize the North not with armies, but with parchment and vows, using his despised son as the clasp on the chain. From that day forth, Tyrion was not merely a disappointment. He was a key. His name was Tyrion of House Lannister, and he limped beside his child bride beneath a reign of mockery. Joffrey smirked. Cersei watched with cold, bright eyes, and courtiers whispered as wine flowed like blood. The feast was noise and heat, a false fire meant to blind them all to the cruelty beneath. When the doors finally closed on the marriage bed, silence fell like snow. Sansa stood rigid, fingers clenched, her fear a living thing in the narrow room. Tyrion, drunk and heartsore, and saw not a ladder to Winterfell, but a girl whose dreams had been torn apart, as his had been long ago in a roadside inn with Tysha. The bed loomed between them like a sentence. He asked her age, he saw her flinch, and he chose. He laid himself down on the hard floor instead, promising in a low, rough voice that he would wait until she wished it otherwise. No one would believe it. Yet in that small act, his battered decency still breathed. Beyond those closed shutters, another storm gathered. Shay, the woman who had laughed with him in the dark and called him lion, found herself given rooms as Sansa's maid, set to brush the hair of the lawful wife while the whore waited in the shadows. Each jest at court, each purse of gold pressed into her hand to keep her hidden, tasted of humiliation. Her jealousy was a wound, her hurt, a mirror held to his own fear that love once more was slipping away. Already he burned with a fire of divided loyalties. At court he was encircled. Joffrey taunted him with crossbows and cruelty. Cersei sharpened every rumour into a dagger. Tywin summoned him like a servant, weighing his worth only in usefulness. Between a wife he could not shield from the Lannisters, and a lover he could not shield from his father, Tyrion stood alone in a hall of watching eyes. The web tightened. Every kindness to Sansa deepened Shay's resentment. Every attempt to placate Shay increased Sansa's peril. Around them the court laughed, drank and plotted, unaware that a single cup of poisoned wine would soon turn that laughter into choking. On that bright, terrible day, beneath banners and song, all this tangled love and duty and buried rage would erupt, and the smallest lion would discover what it meant to be the perfect scapegoat. But the poison was already being poured, drop by secret drop, and the next wedding would not be his salvation. The Purple Wedding. When the world turned on him, the bells rang for joy, but beneath their bright clamour moved an older rhythm, older than crowns, darker than the night, a quiet pulse of hatred and fear. The court gathered beneath silks and sunlight, where music swelled and golden cups were raised, certain that its dragons were chained, its monsters tamed, its future secured in a cruel boy's hands. The wind howled only faintly beyond the high walls, a distant sea breath against the stone, while inside the great hall glowed with fire and wine. Jugglers tumbled, dwarfs capered in mockery of kings and queens, and the laughter that followed was sharp as broken glass. In that storm of sound sat Tyrion Lannister, the smallest lion, wrapped in crimson and shadow at the king's table, watching a world he had saved pretend it had never needed saving. His name was whispered with scorn now, not gratitude. Joffrey, drunk on power and arbor gold, made sport of him as one might torment a chained dog. He forced his uncle to serve as cupbearer, to shuffle and pour while the court roared, to endure jests about his stature, his whores, his supposed cowardice in the night of wildfire and iron. Each insult landed to a chorus of delighted cries, and many of those laughing owed their lives to the man they mocked. Sansa's eyes stayed lowered. Margaery's smile was fixed and careful. Even Jaime, maimed and hollowed, watched in silence as his brother was paraded like a fool. Tyrion tasted the bitterness in his own mouth, more dangerous than any blade, and bowed and poured and played his part, feeling the last fragile threads of his dignity fray. Then the pattern broke. A cough, small at first, lost in the music. Another, harsher. Joffrey's hand went to his throat as if some invisible wire had tightened there. The hall's laughter faltered. The Boy King's face reddened, then darkened, turning a mottled, unnatural purple that would give the feast its name. He clawed at his neck. He tried to speak and could not. Wine and spittle dribbled from his lips as his eyes bulged in naked animal fear. The music stumbled to a halt. Dancers froze. The storm that had been only sound became a storm of motion as courtiers surged back from the royal high table, as if death itself were contagious. Cersei screamed for help, for healers, for someone to do something as her son convulsed in her arms, blood and foam staining her hands. The king who had ordered men burned alive on the Blackwater, choked on his own breath, and there was no sword, no shield, no prayer that could turn the poison aside. When at last Joffrey's body stilled, the silence was total. Then Cersei's grief cracked into something colder. Her eyes, blazing with a mother's madness, found Tyrion where he stood, small and alone, a goblet still in his hand. In that instant, all the fear in the hall needed a shape, a face, a monster. "He did this," she shrieked, her voice cutting through the stunned quiet like steel. "Seize him!" The King's Guard moved without question. White cloaks, bright as snow, closed in. Cold fingers and colder iron wrapped around Tyrion's wrists, the chains snapping shut with a finality that echoed louder than the bells. From that day forth, the tale would be told not of the man who had hurled fire upon Stannis' fleet to save the city, but of the dwarf who murdered his king. There was no proof, there was no need. Cersei required a villain to feed to the realm's fear, and Tyrion had worn that mask since birth. As they dragged him away through a hall of averted eyes and whispered curses, he understood with a clarity that burned like dragonfire. In King's Landing, truth was a shadow, and a hated man's guilt was easier to believe than any innocence. The wedding feast ended in ashes and chains. Ahead waited a cell, a trial, and choices that would spill Lannister blood like wine across the stones. Ice words as weapons, the trial of Tyrion Lannister. The throne room had been a place of crowns and oaths, of banners and bright steel. Now it was remade as a courtroom, colder than any dungeon, its great pillars looming like judges older than crowns, darker than the night, and more dangerous than any blade. The Iron Throne crouched behind it all like jagged shadow, while the air itself seemed to hold its breath. High above, upon the dais, Tywin Lannister sat robed in crimson and gold, not as father but as final arbiter, his pale eyes as hard and distant as winter stars. To his right, Cersei watched with a hatred that had ripened into something poisonous, every line of her face carved by grievance and fear. To his left, Marguerite Tyrell and her kin sat like careful gardeners of power, weighing which way this storm might break, as measuring the soil of King's Landing with cool, assessing gazes. Below them, in the vastness where kings once feasted, there was only a single small man in chains. His name was Tyrion Lannister, and already he burned with a fire that no irons could quite contain. Around him, courtiers, knights, and small folk crowded the hall, a sea of faces turned toward a spectacle of bloodless execution. The witnesses came one by one, like waves grinding a stone into dust. A singer spoke of jests made in passing, reshaped now as whispered plots. A knight recalled a half-heard threat, the words twisted by fear and memory until they seemed to drip with poison. Every kindness Tyrion had ever shown, every sharp jest and bitter truth, was dragged into the light and turned upon him. A gift to a servant became a bribe, a warning to a king became treason. In that hall of echoing lies, truth was a shadow that slipped between torches and vanished into the rafters. The wind howled faintly beyond the high windows, but inside the only storm was made of words. Varys spoke in silk and sorrow. Pycelle trembled and accused. Even memories of the Blackwater, of wildfire on the water and a city saved from Stannis' wrath were recast as proof of a monstrous ambition. He had saved them from fire, they said, only so he might one day claim the ashes. Then Shae was led forth. She walked as if through a dream, painted and perfumed, her eyes refusing to find his. Her voice, once soft in the dark, rang clear in the cold hall as she recited the tale that had been taught to her, how he had used her, how he had plotted, how every word of love had been a lie. She called him a monster. She called him traitor. and at the last, with a cruel rehearsed sweetness, she named him my Giant of Lannister, turning the most private of endearments into a dagger and twisting it slowly in his heart. Something broke then, not loudly, not at first. It was a quieter sound, like a chain snapping in the dark. When Tyrion finally spoke, the hall stilled. His words came low and shaking, then rose, gathering force like a storm over Blackwater. He named their hypocrisy. He named their ingratitude. He reminded them of the night the sea itself had seemed to burn, of how he had stood upon the walls while their trueborn king fled in fear. He told them he had saved their lives, and in his fury he wished he had let them burn. From that day forth no jest could hide what lived in him. He turned his gaze upon Tywin, me upon the judges who had already written his fate in their hearts, and he rejected them all. He would not bend his neck to their verdict, nor beg mercy from the father who had never shown it. Instead, he called upon a harsher, older law, demanding trial by combat once more, choosing the judgment of gods in steel over the cold, fixed eyes upon the dais. The hall gasped. The storm shifted. For a man who could not lift a sword against his enemies, he had thrown open a door that could only lead deeper into night. Beyond it waited a champion, a mountain of flesh and blood, and a battle he could never fight with his own hands. And somewhere, beyond the city walls, the wind began to rise again. Other men's blades. Again. Oberyn, the mountain, and the shattering. The wind howled beyond the Red Keep, a low, awed, restless sound that slipped through arrow slits and under doors as if the city itself sensed what was coming. In the throne room, beneath painted dragons and cold, watchful eyes of stone, Tyrion Lannister waited for another man to decide whether he would live or die. His name was Oberyn Nymeros Martell, the Red Viper of Dawn, and he entered King's Landing like a storm long promised. A prince with poison in his smile and in his spear, he had come with songs of Elia of Dawn in his blood, and with a hatred for Tywin Lannister older than crowns, darker than the night, and more dangerous than any blade. In Tyrion, despised son of that same lord, he did not see a monster. He saw another victim of the same cold, golden cruelty. They drank together in the shadows of his cell. Oberyn spoke of Elia's gentle hands, of her children dashed against walls, of the mountain's mailed fist and Tywin's silent command. Tyrion listened, the wine sour on his tongue, as the prince named his own purpose. He would stand as Tyrion's champion, but the dwarf understood that the man truly meant to stand as Elia's brother. Justice, revenge, and survival had been bound together on the point of a single spear. On the day of the combat, the yard below the royal stands became a circle of stone and fear. Gregor Clegane loomed there like a walking siege tower, iron plates black with old blood, his breath a slow, grinding rasp. Opposite him, Oberyn moved lightly, bare head shining in the sun, spear tip glimmering with a poison that was already a whisper of death. Above them, high in his cage of carved wood, Tyrion watched every step, every heartbeat a countdown. The fight began as a dance. Oberyn circled, feet whispering against the dust, spear testing, teasing, always just beyond the mountain's brutal reach. He taunted as he struck, "Elia of Dawn, say her name." Steel rang, the crowd roared, and with each cut he drew more blood, more stagger, more doubt from the giant who had once seemed unshakable. Hope, that old betrayer, rose like sudden fire in Tyrion's chest. Then came the moment. Clegane fell, armor crashing against stone, his helm split, his life leaking out in dark pools. Oberyn had him. The spear could have ended it. Instead, the Prince of Dawn walked too close, demanding not only victory but confession, circling the truth of Elia's murder as if words themselves could heal the past. The reversal was swifter than a storm breaking. A gauntleted hand seized Oberyn's ankle. The mountain rose, half dead yet towering, and dragged him down. Fingers like iron found his face. There was a scream, a crack, a wet, shattering sound as bone gave way and blood and brains burst bright upon the stones. Silence fell, terrible and complete. In that silence, Tyrion felt something inside him die with the Dornish prince. The gods had spoken through their chosen blades, and they had chosen horror. Law had become spectacle. Family had become executioner. From that day forth he would know that no champion, no oath, no trial by combat would ever be more than a mask for power. Only a miracle remained now, or a betrayal more sudden than any sword. Beyond the walls the wind howled again, as if carrying the sound of chains being forged in some distant waiting dark. Kinslayer, Loveslayer. The night of crossbow and chainy, the wind howled along the black stone of the Red Keep as the city slept, a low, uneasy sound beneath the weight of judgment and wildfire memories. In the bowels of the castle, where torches burned low and chains whispered against stone, a different storm gathered, quiet and unseen, older than crowns, darker than the night, and more dangerous than any blade. His name was Tyrion Lannister, and once more he waited in a cell for death. Footsteps came instead. Jaime appeared at the bars like a ghost of golden days, thinner, wearier, his sword hand gone, his eyes full of a love that had never needed words. They spoke softly, two boys again in memory, recalling a girl named Tisha, a lie told at a father's command, a life broken for the sake of Lannister pride. Jaime's key turned, iron groaned. The brothers embraced, holding too tightly, as if they both knew this parting would echo longer than any song. Then Jaime led him through the bowels of the Red Keep, past forgotten doors and secret stones, into darkness that smelled of dust and old blood. A hidden passage yawned before them, the same road Varys had whispered of, a serpent's path out into the night and across the narrow sea. They said farewell in the shadows, no trumpets, no banners, only a last rough kiss to the brow and a promise that felt thin against the cold. Jaime vanished back toward the light. Tyrion should have gone forward. Instead, he turned. Anger turned him. Curiosity turned him. Pain, older than his scars, older than his cups of wine and masks of japes, drew him upward toward the Tower of the Hand. Each step was a reckoning. Each breath tasted of smoke from the Blackwater, and the ashes of every jest he had ever used to hide his fear. In Tywin's chamber, the bed was not empty. Shay lay in silks that were not hers, in a place that had never been meant for her, the great chain of the hand glinting against her throat like a jest of the gods. For a heartbeat he remembered her laughter, the way she'd called him her lion. Then she reached for a knife, or for words, or for some last lie. They struggled. Pillows tore, sheets twisted, the room filling with the sound of choked breath and desperate hands. His fingers found the chain. It bit into her skin as he pulled, harder, harder, until her eyes bulged and her kicks slowed, until the woman he had loved became only weight in his arms. He whispered apologies into hair that no longer warmed, words she would never hear, as the chain of office cooled against his bleeding palms. The privy stank of false dignity. Tywin Lannister sat upon his seat as if on a throne, back straight, eyes hard, the great lion pretending that no shame could touch him. Tyrion came with a crossbow in his hands and the taste of death still raw upon his tongue. They spoke of Tysha, of lies and whores, and what had been bought with a girl's tears and a boy's soul. Tywin's contempt did not bend. Even now he tried to make his son small with words. Yet words had lost their power over Tyrion. Already he burned with a fire that no jest could quench. The first bolt struck like judgment. The second ended the myth. Tywin Lannister died on the privy, his legend of iron and inevitability shattered by the son he had despised, blood dark on pale thighs. His last breath no grand command but a wet, failing rattle. Tyrion left him there in the stink and shadow, a dead dragon of the western hills toppled from his hoard. Down through the tunnels he went, kinslayer, loveslayer, each step carrying him farther from the man he had been. From that day forth no realm, no god, no ghost of Casterly Rock would ever see him as only victim again. Above, the wind howled once more, as if the city itself understood that something vast had broken. In the dark beyond the walls, a ship waited, and across the narrow sea, a queen with dragons dreamed of fire. What would become of a man who carried such shadows into such flames? Across the narrow sea, a broken man in a new game. The ship waited like a shadow at the edge of the world, and the man who climbed into the crate was not the same one who had once strutted through the Red Keep with a lion's confidence. His name was Tyrion of House Lannister, Kinslayer, Kingslayer in rumour and exile in truth. Around him, the wood closed, the nails bit, and the dark became a coffin that still, somehow, refused to kill him. The voyage across the narrow sea was long, airless, and soaked in the sour reek of his own sweat and spilled wine. In that cramped wooden womb he rolled with each wave and with each memory. Shay's face purpled beneath his hands, Tywin's eyes wide, astonished, as the second quarrel struck. Joanna Lannister's blood on a birthing bed older than crowns, darker than the night. Every jolt of the hull seemed to drive the past deeper, more dangerous than any blade. Varys's murmured words filtered through the cracks, patient, measured, speaking of purpose and princes and a dragon queen far away. Tyrion answered with jokes that tasted of ash. He had mocked the world for so long that the habit moved his tongue even when his heart lay still. Wine dulled the edges, it did not grant sleep. When at last the crate opened in Pentos, the wind howled faintly beyond silk-curtained windows, carrying the salt of a different sea. Illyrio's manse was warm, bright, and heavy with rich food and thicker promises, but Tyrion moved through it like a ghost. Cup after cup vanished into him. His wit flickered, sharp and cruel, yet each jest fell to the floor like broken glass. Westeros lay behind him, a continent of graves. Ahead, Essos sprawled vast and indifferent, a place with no Casterly Rock, no hand's chain, eyed no brother's easy laugh. On the road eastward, rattling in litters and wagons, he watched the free cities slide past in a blur of red lanterns, slave markets, and temples where strange gods drank stranger offerings. The nights grew longer, the cups grew deeper. He gambled, he whored, he argued politics with men who would forget his name by dawn. For the first time, his clever tongue could not quite convince even himself that he belonged anywhere. Yet a name followed him, whispered in taverns, muttered in caravans, carried on the same wind that drove the trade ships. Daenerys Targaryen. A girl become queen, a queen become conqueror, a conqueror with dragons. To some she was saviour, to others a storm made flesh. To Tyrion, at first she was only a rumour, distant and almost mythical. Oh, a last possible refuge or a fresh catastrophe waiting beyond the horizon. Then the game reached out its hand again. Taken by slavers, dragged in chains toward Meereen, he saw the world that had shaped this dragon queen. Fields of human chattel, cities built on backs and blood, masters who spoke of order while the lash sang. He listened to whispers of her sack of Astapor, of Yunkai's freedmen, of pyramids where crucified masters lined the roads like warning posts. Already he burned with a fire he thought long dead, the cold, bright flame of calculation. In Meereen, rebellion gnawed at her rule. Sons of the Harpy struck from shadow, freed slaves clamoured for justice, and dragons smouldered in darkness, half tamed, half wild. Tyrion watched, measured, weighed. Here was power raw and unstable. A young queen wrestling with forces that might devour her, or the world. At last he stood before her, a small man in foreign dust, bearing a lion's name and a lifetime of ruin. Between them lay the silence of all that might be. He offered his mind, his counsel, his stained lineage to the last Targaryen dragon. Was he saving himself? Dooming her? Or binding fire to shadow for some fate neither yet could see? Outside, beyond the broken streets of Meereen, the wind howled over the sea again, as if the narrow sea itself remembered the man in the crate and wondered what storm his arrival would now unleash. Hand of a dragon, counsel, failure, and fire. The storm he had ridden in upon did not break at once. It gathered slow and heavy over Meereen's pyramids. While a small man with tired eyes sat before a queen born in fire and weighed his own worth against her dragons, he spoke first of enemies, of Cersei, who would burn cities before she bent the knee, of the lords of Westeros who bowed to strength, to gold, to fear. Every house, every king, every battle had its own truth, he said, but there were powers older than crowns, darker than the night, and more dangerous than any blade. Her name was Daenerys Stormborn. His name was Tyrion of House Lannister. Between them lay a continent of ashen memory. He told her that seizing a throne was nothing if the same cruel wheel kept turning. Baratheon, Lannister, Targaryen, Stark, Tyrell. Up and down, blood and fire, then blood again. "Break the wheel," he urged, with a quiet fervour that surprised even him. Not simply to rule, but to shatter the order that had crushed bastards, cripples and exiles alike. Already he burned with a fire that was not dragon flame, but something colder and more stubborn, the belief that his mind might yet matter. When she placed the hand's pin in his palm, it lay there like a shard of the past. The same shape that had once gleamed upon his doublet in King's Landing, heavy with his father's scorn and a city's hatred. Now it rose, slow and deliberate, to his chest again, fastening him to a different sovereign, a different war. From that day forth, he walked Meereen's halls as Hand of the Queen, a dwarf shadow pacing beside a woman of dragons, trying to fashion mercy out of fire. Yet the world beyond their council chamber did not bend so easily. Tyrion saw his plans to take Westeros with minimal blood unravelled beneath black sails and sudden flame. Fleets burned. Allies died screaming on strange shores. In his mind, he had outplayed Cersei 100 times. In truth, he had underestimated the depth of her cold hatred, and overestimated how gently war could ever fall upon the innocent. Each failure drove the Queen harder. Each loss stripped another layer of softness from her voice. The wind howled over the bay when she burned the Tarleys, father and son, to smoking bone, their shadows writhing in dragonfire while armies looked on in fearful silence. Tyrion watched the flames dance in her eyes and felt something shift, a hairline crack in the image of the saviour he had chosen. He counselled restraint, pleaded for prisoners instead of pyres, for sieges instead of slaughter. But her inner circle tightened like a noose. Grey Worm with his implacable gaze, Missandei with her unwavering faith, dragons circling above like living storms. His words grew lighter even as the pin on his chest felt heavier, as if some unseen hand were weighing his soul against the cities yet to burn. Ahead lay King's Landing, the city he had once saved with wildfire and wit. Now he dreamed of bells, of children running through streets he knew by smell and sound, and woke with the taste of ash in his mouth. Was he guiding a liberator toward a just dawn, or had he once more given his trust to a tyrant wrapped in prophecy and flame? The answer waited where Dragon Shadow would fall longest, over a city's broken stones and a sky torn open by fire. The bells and the ash, watching a dream burn. The wind howled over the encamped host outside King's Landing, tugging at banners heavy with lions and dragons alike, as if the night itself questioned which sigil would stand at dawn. Within that restless dark, Tyrion Lannister moved like a smaller shadow among greater ones. Already he burned with a fire that was half hope, half dread. He went first to his brother. In a tent lit by guttering candles, he freed Jaime from chains he himself had helped fasten. The Kingslayer's golden hand gleamed dull and cold, a mockery of all the oaths they had broken. Tyrion begged him to take Cersei, to flee by secret boat, to vanish into some nameless exile where no dragon shadow fell. It was treason against his queen, mercy toward a sister who had wished him dead, and love for the only man who had ever looked at him without disgust. When the brothers embraced, from that day forth the choice would haunt every silence between them. Beyond the tent walls, another bargain had already been struck in whispers and ash. Varys, spider of 100 plots, had weighed Daenerys and found her wanting. Tyrion, torn between fear of a tyrant and faith in a liberator, betrayed his old ally to the very queen they both doubted. His name was once spoken in courts as the cleverest of Lannisters. Now his counsel fed the pyre that would test what sort of fire lived in hers. Morning came like a drawn blade. The dragon descended out of cloud and sun. Drogon's scream tearing the sky as the walls and fleet burned beneath a rain of living flame. Stone melted, men burst like overripe fruit, and the city Tyrion had once saved with wildfire and wit shuddered under a different kind of storm. Yet amid the roar and ruin, a sound rose that was not fire. Bells, first one, then a chorus, tolling across rooftops and broken towers. Lannister soldiers let their swords fall, steel clattering on cobbles slick with blood and fear. The city had yielded. For one fragile heartbeat, as smoke curled and the bells cried surrender, Tyrion believed the worst was passing. The war was over. It should have been. Then the dragon turned. Drogon's shadow slid along the streets like a dark tide, older than crowns, darker than the night, and more dangerous than any blade. Daenerys did not bank away. She dove, Fire poured from an open moor, not at soldiers but at streets, at houses, Ardeza's mothers clutching children who had never heard of dragons except in stories. Hidden wildfire caches erupted in sudden green blossoms, mixing with red and gold flame until King's Landing became a single screaming furnace. Tyrion watched his last great hope burn. The city he had once defended with chains across the Blackwater, now drowned in fire and ash. Where he had used flame as shield, she wielded it as scourge. Every compromise, every excuse, every time he had said that the world must be broken to be remade, now answered him in the shrieks of the dying. When the fires finally guttered, and the smoke lay low and thick, he walked through what remained. Charred bodies lay where crowds had once jostled and cursed. Stones that had heard 1,000 market cries now held only silence. The wind howled faintly through blackened arches, carrying the stench of cooked flesh and the faint crackle of embers. In that ruin, Tyrion saw the sum of his choices. His faith had been a torch in the dark, and he had placed it in the hands of a dragon. He found Jaime and Cersei not in some far escape, but buried together beneath collapsed stone, faces dusted white like statues in a tomb. Whatever monsters they had been, they had died as frightened mortal things. Tyrion wept, not only for them, but for the boy who had once dreamed of saving the city, and for the man who had failed it twice. When Daenerys stood before her army amid the drifting ash, hailed as queen of a broken world, Tyrion stepped forward. He unpinned the hand's brooch from his chest, the last weight of his borrowed authority, and cast it at her feet so that it rang against the stone like a small defiant bell. See, he chose chains over complicity, a cell over the comfort of lies. In that moment he turned his back on the dragon he had helped unleash, knowing that the next choice he made would decide whether this fire consumed only a city or an entire age. And in the cold quiet of his cell with dragon wings beating somewhere above the ruined capital, another, darker question began to coil around his thoughts, waiting for its answer. Choosing a king, from prisoner to kingmaker. The wind howled beyond the blackened walls of the Red Keep, a low grieving sound threading through stone split by dragonfire. In the cell where Tyrion waited, the night felt older than crowns, darker than the night itself, as if the city were holding its breath for judgment. His name was Tyrion Lannister, once Hand of the Queen, once saviour of this same capital. Now he sat in chains among the ashes of his own council, listening to the distant creak of timbers and the soft crumble of charred stone. Somewhere above, Daenerys Targaryen walked through the ruin she had made, and each slow footstep in his mind weighed more than any blade. When Jon Snow came, the air in the cell shifted, like the first hint of a storm rolling over a dead sea. Jon still smelled of smoke and cold steel, his eyes shadowed by what he refused to name. He spoke of a love, of loyalty, of the Dragon Queen who had broken a city to break a chain. Tyrion answered with the only weapon left to him, words. He laid out the trail of fire and blood that had led them here. Astapor, Meereen, the crucified masters, the burnt Tarleys on the ash-choked field. Each mercy Daenerys had promised, each enemy she had scorched in the name of a better world. Had the pattern not always been there, waiting in her eyes? Love, he told Jon, does not wash the soot from children's bones. Duty, older than crowns, darker than the night, may demand the unthinkable. The choice before Jon was not between a woman and a throne, but between one more tyrant on Dragonback and the faint, fragile hope of something gentler. The words cut Jon deeper than any sword. That was their purpose. They were more dangerous than any blade. From that day forth, the memory of that conversation would burn in Jon like a secret brand. He left the cell with his jaw clenched and his shoulders bowed, a man walking into a storm he could neither refuse nor fully understand. When next Tyrion saw the light, it was not to kneel before Daenerys, but to stand, shackled, in the broken dragon pit before a ring of lords and ladies. Smoke still coiled over the city. The wind tugged at torn banners, carrying the faint stench of cooked stone and burned flesh. He was unshaven, gaunt, his golden hair dulled by dust, yet when he raised his head, his eyes were clear. They spoke of succession, of armies, of rightful claims written in blood. He spoke of failure of kings and queens who had chased crowns like dragonfire, only to leave graves behind. What kind of ruler, he asked, could break the wheel instead of grinding more bodies beneath it? His answer was a boy in a chair of dark wood and quiet, unfathomable stillness. Bran Stark, Bran the Broken. A king who did not want power, who could not ride, could not swing a sword, but who carried within him the memory of the realm, stretching back through storm and shadow to days when even dragons were young. Stories rule men more surely than fear, Tyrion said. Let the realm be bound not by terror from the sky, but by a king whose very life was a living chronicle, a reminder of every folly and every mercy. Already he burned with a fire that was not of dragons but of remembrance. There, in the ruined pit where dragons had once been chained, the smallest man in the hall in irons guided the choice of a king. In raising Bran, he tried to raise a different kind of world, one where broken things might sit where only the beautiful had sat before. Outside, the wind howled again, as if testing the new order, and somewhere in Tyrion's tired heart, a question lingered like a cold ember. Had he truly broken the wheel, or merely taught it a quieter way to turn? The last hand. A life measured in scars and stories. So Tyrion bent his neck once more beneath the weight of a golden hand, not for love of crowns, nor for the bright lie of glory, but because there was no one else who both knew the cost of power and feared it enough to hesitate before using it. In the shattered throne room, with ash still clinging to the stones like old snow, Bran the Broken watched him with eyes that seemed older than crowns, darker than the night. The pin lay between them, small as a coin, heavy as a sentence. Tyrion's fingers shook when he took it. From that day forth, his name was Hand again, though the realm he served was a ghost of the one he had once tried to save with wildfire and iron chains. The small council that gathered around him was a stranger's dream of power. Bronn of the Blackwater, who now Lord of Highgarden, lounged in a lord's chair as if it were a tavern bench, speaking of tolls and tariffs in the same breath as brothels. Sir Davos, smelling faintly of tar and salt, measured every ship and every promise as if they were planks in a storm. Brienne sat straight-backed in white, a living shield in a hall that had seen too few. Samwell Tarly, soft-voiced and round, stacked books like bricks, building a quiet wall against ignorance. They spoke of roads first, because roads meant food, and food meant fewer knives in the night. They argued over coin, over ships to rebuild a burned fleet, over laws that might bind lords who had learned that dragons could fall from the sky. Outside, the wind howled through broken courtyards, carrying the faint, bitter scent of old fire. Inside, Tyrion measured every jest, every order, against all the blood that had answered his words in years past. He was never alone at that table. Tywin sat at his shoulder in memory, cold and disapproving, whispering of strength and fear as the only true coins. Shay's fingers seemed to brush his throat whenever he hesitated, a phantom chain that tightened when he spoke too softly. Oberyn's laughing eyes flashed whenever justice was mentioned, a reminder that courage without care was more dangerous than any blade. And Daenerys, walking through his thoughts like a shadow of dragonfire, stood beside every choice that risked a city for the sake of an idea. What would the songs make of such a man? Kinslayer, for the father he killed on a privy of stone, city saver for the green inferno on the Blackwater that turned a losing battle into a legend, betrayer, Vaim, for the queen he had once believed might break the world's chains and instead had to be stopped with a knife in the dark, or Kingmaker, for the moment when he pointed to a broken boy and set a different kind of dragon upon a wordless throne. Perhaps the truth of Tyrion Lannister lay not in any single deed, but in the long, jagged line they traced together. A dwarf born in his mother's blood, taught that he was a monster, who spent a lifetime trying to prove that a mind might be a gentler weapon than steel, and finding again and again that even a clever tongue could burn like fire. Already he burned with a fire that no wine could quench, the need to do a little better with the power that still clung to his hands. In the end, his legacy was a question left hanging over a quieter realm. Was he the wound, or the scar that formed after? The council's murmurs faded, the torches guttered low, and in the high seat Bran watched the hand who had chosen him, as the wind howled beyond the broken walls and the story of Tyrion Lannister refused to settle into a single, simple name. The Halfman's Measure. What Tyrion's life reveals about power. Power had circled him from the cradle, a storm of gold and crimson banners that never once warmed his skin. He was born a Lannister, yet his first taste of power was the taste of blame, for his first breath stole his mother's last. From that day forth, every glance from his father carried a quiet sentence: mistake, burden, curse. In the deep halls of Casterly Rock, where the sea roared like a caged dragon in the caverns below, the child learned the measure of himself in echoed laughter and averted eyes. Tywin's word was law. Tywin's will an iron crown, older than crowns, darker than the night in the boy's imagination. Tyrion shared his father's mind, sharp as broken glass, but not his father's cold. Where Tywin saw pieces on a board, Tyrion saw faces, heard voices, remembered names. His name was mocked in taverns and courts alike, twisted into jests that left bloodless cuts. So he wrapped himself in wine and words, in books and brothels, in the bitter armour of a man who strikes first with his tongue. Yet every cruelty he suffered bent him toward the broken. A bastard at Winterfell on a cold night at the Wall, a scarred sellsword in a sky cell, a child queen in a foreign city. Again and again he reached for those the world had already cast aside. His empathy was a small fire against a vast dark, more dangerous than any blade. Because it could move his heart when reason warned him to turn away. The wind howled over King's Landing when his wildfire burned Stannis' fleet, green fire clawing at the sky. He saved a city that spat on his name, and the reward was a scar across his face and a quiet attempt to erase him from the game he had just won. Later, in another night of torches and shadows, he killed the woman who had sold his love and the father who had sold his soul. That crossbow in the privy was not only patricide, it was a son cutting his own likeness out of his chest, lest he become the very monster who made him. Across the narrow sea his cleverness staggered, meeting dragons and zealots whose fury did not bend to reason. He could read ledgers and lords, but not always the gathering storm inside Daenerys, nor the silent calculations in Varys' eyes. His plans saved slaves and toppled tyrants, yet could not foresee ash falling on a city he had once bled to protect. In the end, he placed a broken boy upon a shattered throne room floor, choosing a king of memory instead of fire. Did he break the wheel, or merely slow its grinding teeth, turning them away from open war toward quieter bargains in a colder hall? The question lingered like smoke, drifting toward the next generation, waiting for new hands to decide whether the wheel would turn again or finally come to rest. Echoes of the Imp. Your Tyrion. Your Westeros. Beyond those quieter bargains, the world did not sleep. The wind howled along the cliffs of Casterly Rock, as it had when his name was first whispered in scorn and in fear, rattling the lion's lair where a twisted child once learned that words could cut more dangerous than any blade. Far to the east, a colder wind coiled through the broken streets of King's Landing, over stones blackened by dragonfire and blood. In the west, the sea beat itself to foam against the rock, older than crowns, darker than the night, wearing down golden cliffs one patient wave at a time. In the ruined capital, ash still clung to carvings of kings long dead, and the shadows of dragons seemed to flicker in shattered windows when the storm rolled in from Blackwater Bay. Between those two ghosts of power, in a smaller, quieter hall, an aging hand bent over parchment as the candles guttered low. His hair had gone thin, his back ached when the cold crept in, and the cup at his elbow was never quite full enough. Yet his eyes remained sharp, pale and watchful, as if they still searched for wildfire on the water or treachery in a sister's smile. Already he burned with a fire that no wine could quench, a stubborn ember of memory that refused to die, no matter how many kings had risen and fallen before him. Somewhere in that world, Tyrion Lannister still sat at a table long after the court had gone to bed, quill scratching, lips moving around half-remembered jests that no one remained to hear. He weighed grain against steel, mercy against fear, a single spared life against a dozen quiet executions. He tried, as he always had, to turn stories of horror into policies of mercy, one weary decision at a time, knowing that every line of ink might save a child or doom a city. For some, he would forever be the sharp-tongued hand of King's Landing, standing upon the walls as the green fire rose and the sea became a screaming, burning grave. For others, he was the broken exile crossing the narrow sea in a stinking crate, a man who had killed the woman he loved and the father he hated, drifting toward a dragon queen and a war he did not yet believe in. And for many, he was the reluctant kingmaker in the end, choosing a boy of stories over a queen of fire. Was he hero, villain, survivor, or something shifting and uncertain between those names, as changeable as the wind that scours the rock and sighs through the charred bones of the capital? In the quiet that follows the last spoken word, let each listener decide which Tyrion sits most clearly in the mind's eye, and let that judgment be written like a small stubborn line of ink in the great ledger of this world. Let the comments become a small council of their own, a circle of voices weighing his life. There, his deeds may be named, his sins counted, his mercies remembered. There, other lives may be called for. The winter-bound honour of Stark, the golden pride of Lannister, the burning doom of Targaryen, each house a different kind of fire, each story a different cost. For in a realm of dragons and thrones, it is not always the conquerors who teach what power truly is. Often it is the smallest voices, the dwarfs, the bastards, the broken things, whose words outlive the roar of war and the blaze of dragonfire. Their truths creep through the cracks of great halls and ruined keeps, whispering of prices paid in blood and in silence. Somewhere, beyond the circle of candlelight, a new tale waits in the dark, its first breath already forming, its first name not yet spoken. The wind howled outside the tower window and the world turned on patient and hungry, ready to crown another soul with its weight.